Our next panel is going to look at the first 48 hours and how you can avoid compounding a crisis. Our speaker today is Judy Rakowsky, who leads the crisis practice for the Liberty Square Group. Judy helps clients develop and execute the right strategy even when lightning strikes their brand or reputation. Judy spent decades on Deadline and as an award-winning reporter and editor at The Globe, People magazine, and the Providence Journal and other outlets. She loved to generate crises, to dig into crime, politics, and scandal. That understanding of how stories can rise and fall and the life cycle of litigation from covering courts has turned into the experience that clients need when facing negative news. Judy helps clients achieve their goal of driving attention to the untold side of a story or managing a runaway narrative that poses an existential threat to a company, nonprofit, or individual. This background and experience can be a game changer for clients who feel powerless in the mercurial media landscape we have today. Judy?
Good morning. So think of Deflategate, when Suffolk University fired Margaret McKenna, its sixth president in 6 years. Columbia Gas's fatal explosion in 2018. National Grid, 6-month strike. Sexual abuse scandal, St. Paul's School. That's in New Hampshire, St. George's in Rhode Island, and I could name many others. Remember Market Basket's employee work stoppage over the good Arthur and the bad Arthur? The Back Bay fire that killed 2 firefighters in 2014? Data breaches at Target, Stop and Shop, Marriott, Equifax, Starbucks. Starbucks was another issue. Any number of Me Too, Title IX, sexual misconduct allegations, some involving the legislature, every university around. All of these things implicate crisis communications. It's whether your brand is going to survive, your stock price is going to endure, whether your endowment, your enrollment. Communications is a critical piece of that, often overlooked or delayed. So that's why today we're going to talk about the first 48 hours and how much it can influence whether you literally endure or not. So I think we all know that the days are gone when a company or a nonprofit or an individual could just wait it out and just hope for the best. We have a merciless social media environment, and it's absolutely such a difference from my many years in the media when we thought people were going to wait till the media told them what happened. It's just not the way it is anymore. What happens in the very, very beginning are people make these judgments that it's a good company, a bad company. They're very sort of simplistic. I think we could all, when we think of these incidents, we do attach strong opinions. And if you don't participate in the narrative in any way, you can harden those opinions, or actually there's no other side ever coming out. It's the character of the company that you start to attach these actions to. Things happen, but then it's like, what did they do? Is this self-inflicted? Is this something that you could start to cure or compound? So that's why crisis communications is a growth industry. I should be unhappy to say, but we're going to talk about some examples that bring this to light today. But I just want to say that in my decades in the media, I was often making the call, sending the email to the entity that had something happen. And I know that, it doesn't feel good, even though if you're, in the hated whatever media, to be treated like the enemy. But what really comes across when you get stonewalled and hung up on, et cetera, no comment, is you start to think maybe it wasn't something that just happened. Maybe there's arrogance, maybe there's callousness. And that's why it's a very, there's the subjective element here in how opinions are formed. And that's where it can become a compounded crisis. I'm not here to say the press is your friend, but it can be an asset if you manage it properly. They are providing curated content versus what just goes out, on social media and the sort of something that hasn't had any consideration going into how it's formed. Sometimes, since I've come to this side of the table in crisis communications, that first 48 hours can compound the problem that we are starting to try to cure because, and this is, I have real examples that I just can't talk about for confidentiality, but sometimes a statement of apology has already been issued in which there's an implication that things happened that didn't. Sometimes there's just so much chaos and completely ignoring the communications piece that, again, the press is already hostile. And sometimes the client has already dug in or been given bad advice that just say nothing, you can't do anything about it, just do the ostrich maneuver. And that is when you, as a crisis communications entity, you really have harder work ahead of you. It's not insurmountable, but it's not easy. So one of the biggest challenges is when you don't have any plan. And this actually piggybacks nicely off the last panel because they said many times, plan, plan, plan. And, to your point, small and medium-sized businesses and small nonprofits, they don't have a crisis plan. They would never, they might talk about it, but they'd say that's never gonna happen. The challenge is that every company, every nonprofit is vulnerable to a crisis, regardless of their size, how beloved they are, their enduring reputation, or how long they've been around. And, like I said at the beginning, you can see how many entities really have had things happen to them that you might think never could. But the biggest, and I'm not advocating that, if you have crisis communications people or a good press operation, you're gonna come out with a long statement or put the CEO up for a tell-all interview with, with a national broadcast entity. No, it means starting to think about how you're going to communicate, to whom, along what channel, just all the things that go into getting your message right. And it is not that you're necessarily going to say a lot in the first 48 hours, but the most important game-changing thing is acting like you care. And that doesn't mean you have to say a lot, but there are ways to do it. And some of you may remember or know that actually the Tylenol tampering case is still seen as this beacon example in the crisis communications space. And that was in 1982. It's kind of crazy that we have that, a case from that long ago that's really still the model. So I don't know how many of you were alive when this happened, but there were, it was in Chicago, and can anybody tell me how many people died? Does anyone remember? Okay, it was 7 deaths. The company quickly determined that it wasn't from a manufacturing facility or something that they did. And what was sort of counter the corporate culture of the time, and perhaps still today, was that they were very quick to respond, forthcoming and honest, and they acted decisively. The afternoon the first deaths were reported, Johnson & Johnson set up a toll-free number staffed by employees so that anyone could call. They sent 450,000 telexes, I don't know if anyone remembers what a telex is, to doctors' offices, hospitals, and trade groups. They stopped all advertising for Tylenol. And the key was they empathized with who was harmed, the families who lost members, and, just the impact of this incident. They took some responsibility, even though we know that it was, someone who actually, a bad actor who took these, who did the cyanide tainting of the containers. And they kept communicating. This was not, there was no Twitter. I don't even think there was email then. But they were communicating throughout. And within 5 days, they did a nationwide recall without any prompting by an agency or an official. And within a year, they recovered their 30% market share. So it's like a business case and a communications case, and that's part of why it's still talked about. But I have to add the footnote that this is perhaps not a lasting corporate culture, because we know that Johnson & Johnson is in the middle of the opioid crisis now and negotiating settlements. So many companies and organizations have good intentions. They have people inside feeling horrible about something that goes wrong, but that never gets communicated, because it's largely because of the fog of chaos that occurs when an incident happens. And again, this goes back to the message from the previous panel about planning. If you don't have a plan and a crisis occurs, the top leadership is just besieged, trying to figure out which way to turn. And we heard some things in the previous panel about what you have to do within certain periods of time. You're contacting your insurer, you're trying to figure out, if the law firm that you have can handle what's happening to you. There's just so much going on. And maybe you're trying to reach out to whoever's been hurt. And it's just really, really hard to do all of this quickly. The biggest problem is you have too many actors. You need a core crisis team, a top member of leadership. And of course, I have to add the caveat that sometimes the crisis involves the leadership. So then you have to have some thought to who's going to be deciding how to respond when the person that is in the middle of it is actually your CEO. You have to know, which outside experts and cloak all of this in attorney-client privilege so it doesn't become part of the litigation later. There's so many competing, very, very urgent and important things to do. The last thing people think about, usually, is deciding whether, how much, with whom, and on what channels to communicate. It seems like something that can be done later, but again, the opinions are forming, the plaintiff's attorneys are being hired, all these things are happening, and you haven't said boo. It's almost impossible to do this well and quickly in this age of merciless social media without some planning, some forethought, and even knowing who to talk to, because your internal marketing and communications teams are rarely, if ever, trained to do crisis. And even if they are, and if they're your great partners for your outside crisis communications people, they're often in the chain of command of the people that, it's harder to give really objective advice when you're telling your boss that they're wrong, that you need to do X and Y. And it's all in a very high-stress time. So you absolutely need trusted crisis communications counsel. And, the thing I've learned the most is how deadly silos can be during this time. Because if your communications people aren't in direct contact with the legal team, even if the legal team is going to edit a statement or whatever, and you can't have some back and forth with also the people that are deciding on the content or what has to happen, it can really be, you can have a less than optimal response. So again, that's why you need a plan. What you need to anticipate are the range of things that can occur to your company that would render it inoperable, or you might have to close a school, what you would have to do. The other thing that people don't think about are alternate ways to communicate if you can't use your business network, if you can't, if you're using your cell phones, making sure it's these little details that can make a critical difference. Sometimes you have to have a plan to meet off-site. A lot of companies remember what they tried to do the day of 9/11, when they didn't even know who was on what plane, or if they were in the country, or where anybody was. That doesn't mean we all learned from it, because all these things seem to go away and you're on to the next, right? You need to think about who would be the spokesperson and train them. You don't want an untrained person going out to give a comment and getting questions that they answer in a not helpful way. And you need to update that training. And, again, you don't want to go out there without a plan, and you don't want the CEO to be the only spokesperson for the company. And in a little bit, we're going to see some examples of how some very highly trained, very sophisticated people can not help in a crisis. So what happens when you don't have a plan is you react, and just reacting is very risky. You need also to try to test some messages in advance before you go out there and start saying things. And as was referred to in the previous panel, to have holding statements that can be updated so that you can respond more quickly. So, and then of course, everything's going to continue to change, and you have to monitor what's being said, written, talked about, so you can respond to the evolving situation. So let's take an example. I mentioned that Back Bay fire in 2014. It was March, it was cold and windy, and there was a company called D&J Ironworks of Malden. And they were working on some welding on a wrought iron at a neighboring house in the Back Bay. The wind took some sparks from this welding operation, and it just engulfed this whole condo and destroyed an entire building. And 2 firefighters, Lieutenant Ed Walsh and firefighter Michael Kennedy, went in thinking that they were rescuing someone, and they perished. So what happened right away was the press started calling the company before a lot of these facts were known, and the line was disconnected. There was no comment from the company in any way, and the narrative was framed completely by law enforcement and others. In fact, the only time that there was anything said on behalf of Giuseppe Falcone, the owner of the company, was when his lawyer said that he is, quote, not acknowledging that he was involved in any way, shape, or form. That didn't ring too true. I mean, they were there, they were welding, it was something that did not help them. And at that point, the company had been stonewalling, the press had framed them as, the bad guys, and then there were OSHA fines, findings against the company in every way. There was no permit for supervision of the welding. And even though the company said that there were others responsible, nothing else ever came to light casting blame anywhere else. There were lots of civil lawsuits, and I'm not sure the company still exists. It might have changed its name, but they certainly didn't announce that. So that's kind of a stark example of not doing anything to frame your own narrative. On a national level, Starbucks, which had a previous fail with their Race Together campaign, they did something that's considered to have been beneficial to them ultimately, after the April 2018 incident when 2 African-American men went into a Starbucks and they were waiting for a friend, and a Starbucks employee found something suspicious about them, called the police, and they were arrested. They this, I don't know if you remember, it wasn't that long ago, but there were protests around Starbucks. And the usual corporate stance would be, oh, this is an isolated incident, and to just distance the corporation from them. But in fact, the Starbucks CEO, Kevin Johnson, was interviewed in the press, and he said, the fact that what happened in our store and the outcome from that incident was reprehensible, that should not have happened, it was wrong, and my role and responsibility as CEO is to learn, to understand it, and to fix it. And that was pretty refreshing from a CEO at that time. So Starbucks then closed 8,000 stores for the day for training in unconscious racial bias, which, some people criticize them for, what does one day of training do? How can that, really change a whole culture? However, they did give up $12 million in profits for one day. So it wasn't just, an empty gesture. And then 5 weeks later, Starbucks declared all their bathrooms open to everyone without purchase. So that's now become the public bathroom, Starbucks. The charges were dropped. I mean, Starbucks never actually pressed charges. The employee no longer works for the company. And just actually this week, the city of Philadelphia's settled with the two men for just $1, but they've created a program for serving inner city youth in entrepreneurial ways. So there's something that happened in response to a very unfortunate incident, and that is seen as a success. It's also, if you see it, the way that he responded, it is along the lines of the Tylenol leadership, taking responsibility, taking action, and not hiding. So the notifications about data breaches brings up a big issue with communications, and that's timing. There's the social media challenges. There's just the quickness with which we all read about something and then sort of move on. I think we can all acknowledge that we're very quick to form opinions now, perhaps quicker than ever, and we don't really stick around too much to figure out what happened. And that's actually can be, I mean, there's some situations that you can ride out, but most of the time, that narrative is formed by one side. It's challenging in particular for private versus publicly traded companies. There's a whole different consideration for what you have to tell the SEC, not just with data breaches, but the challenge of getting everyone inside a publicly traded company to be on the same page about what should be said is a lot greater. But, and I will just make this point about data breach notifications. Some of these laws and requirements for notifications came from the negative examples. Uber detected a breach, a hack, in the month's time, and took a year to notify anyone. And Equifax, its name is almost a punchline at this point. It took months after it discovered a massive data breach to notify anyone. And there's more bad behavior that's been associated with the Equifax incident. But they actually compounded the challenge to their brand by that very delay. And yes, the details of when's the notification, as you heard, are something to be determined and with help from lawyers. But the trickiest thing coming along now is ransomware, which we're hearing a lot more about. And there are plenty of entities, I even know some lawyers who've been hit with it, and they paid the ransom, got the data back, and then they decided, do I tell my clients or do I not? Did getting the data back cure it? So it's a complex question, and there's not as much practice and law associated with ransomware yet. It's obviously a growing area, so we're going to be hearing more about that. There's also requirements that you have to tell your insurance company that you were hit with ransomware, and that's more challenging too, because some people think if I just pay it and get the data back, no harm done. Unless you're the city of Baltimore and your 911 system goes down. So it's a big area. The thing about the data breach notifications is exactly what do you say, how do you say it, and again, it's this tricky thing about how much responsibility you take when you don't exactly know all of the facts. And when, are you notifying everyone right away before you know exactly what happened? So there's a lot of play in that wheel. And that is really, again, another growth area. The thing about what you say when you do say something to the public and all your various stakeholders, and this is where you have to, again, be definitely protected by attorney-client privilege, is that it has to be true. Whatever you say has to be accurate. And we see on the political arena, there's a lot of questions about that. But also, you don't want to be proven to be hypocritical. If you come out and say one thing and then, it comes out later that you had a policy or you lied or whatever, you just compound the challenges to your brand. The trickiest area, I think, right now in this landscape are the Me Too, Title IX, a lot of these allegations. I don't know if anyone remembers, but the New York Times, at the height of Me Too, they ran a big page that had a whole, graph of offender, accusation, what happened to them, apology statement, and, what the latest status was. And I just remember looking at that page, and if you covered up the who, you'd look at the statement and you say, wow, that sounds really good. Wow, that should have cured that. And then you look over and the best statement was by Weinstein. And it was just startling because, just coming out with a good statement is not necessarily going to serve your client the best. Because if it's not credible, then you can have the most beautiful statement in the world. And of course, that had come out after a lot of allegations. So it's a very tricky landscape, and a lot of times there is little that can be said at certain stages. So again, by saying that you need to communicate, I'm not saying you need to just communicate all the time and just say things. It just has to be very strategic. The other thing is choosing the right communication channel. Again, those statements that were written, that was not Weinstein coming out and saying that, or even his lawyer. That's a written statement. That expression of empathy on behalf of, for anyone who was harmed by something, sometimes is best done verbally, and then you can decide, does that mean you go out in front of the press and say it verbally and then run so you don't get asked any questions? These are all very tactical decisions that you need to make. Social media can be a great tool to provide updates and valuable information, but then you could get slammed and besieged by the response to that social media. It's a cost-benefit analysis with each type of communication that you might choose, each channel. You also need to figure out where your audiences get their information. If you're going to communicate with a bunch of lawyers, you probably aren't going to go on Twitter because they're on LinkedIn. Or if you're going to communicate with a very young audience, you're not going to, put it in the New York Times, sorry. But you just really need to figure out where the people are that you're trying to communicate with. The big elephant in the room in a lot of these situations is the media. When the media gets regarded as purely the enemy and you don't want to deal with them, you can really compound your crisis. Once the media gets hostile, it can be very hard to get it back. You want to come across as earnest, responsive, and say what you can, and also say what you can't or don't know yet. And that's really important because a lot of times, a lot of us who are, perfectionists want to just get all the facts before we go say anything. Sometimes just admitting that you're doing the best you can to get to the bottom of things can be actually very persuasive. It's important to have a spokesperson, oftentimes someone that may not even be a member of the organization, but someone that has the trust and can convey to the media that they are really trying hard to get to all your requests, that you're getting on the list, so that if there's going to be a release, that you're going to be on the list. We've seen this very, very clearly. My firm has been representing Columbia Gas for the last year, and it's been really busy. And Scott Furson, the president of my firm, who has been the face of Columbia Gas, has had really good relationships with the press. They know that he's trying to get them the information. And in most media, their story has been told very straight. And I think that is a high, connectivity with that earnest, trying to help you, trying to get your answers. If I don't have the answer, I'll tell you I don't have the answer. It really goes a long way. You'd be surprised. But it also demonstrates the values of the organization if you have a strong spokesperson and you show that you value the media as an entity that's trying to get the facts and trying to, get to communicate with the public. Now, the content, the timing, all of these things are very tactical. You also need to be monitoring what all's being said and know which way, the incoming is coming from. So I think we're going to show you some examples of how you can have the biggest companies that you think would have the best lawyers, the best training, the best spokespeople going, and they don't do it right. So you may recognize this guy.
We're sorry, actually. We're sorry for the massive disruption it's caused to their lives. And, there's no one who wants this thing over more than I do. I'd like my life back.
So I don't know if you remember the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. It was the largest marine oil spill in history. There are 11 workers that also want their lives back, that don't have them anymore. It also injured 17 people, left a thick coating of oil on the seafloor, stopped all fishing. 12,000 people were unemployed. The tourism industry off the Gulf was, ended. And people have debated, and I remember this on crisis communications blogs. They're like, okay, does anybody think that guy should have been out there at that point? And he was, I'm sure he was hot and tired and, getting a question from someone that he didn't want to talk to. But that is now famous. Tony Hayward, in case you ever want to see what he's up to now. Also, his seeming candor was belied by the fact that BP said that 1,000 barrels of oil per day were discharging into the Gulf, when it was later found to be 60,000 barrels of oil a day. And so the disingenuousness really came back to bite him. He could have said no comment, but so, you see the way that it weighs whether you go out there or not. Hit the next.
It has been an extremely long day. I'm having a hard trouble talking at the moment. I would appreciate it if we could wrap this thing up. I will.
Well, we actually have a lot of questions, and it's been a long day for a lot of people who don't have water. So can you give us an exact timeline as to how this all happened? The DEP was saying earlier today, as early as 8:15 yesterday morning, they were getting reports, and that you all did not call it in until 12 noon. The DEP was already here at 11:15. So what's the timeline on all this?
We were aware of the leaking storage tank around 10:30. We load tank trucks of this material on a regular basis, and occasionally we've had reports of an odor previously. So we were first aware of any material being spilled at 10:30 yesterday.
Could it have been earlier than yesterday? Because we've also received reports into our newsroom that it was as early as Wednesday, possibly Tuesday. People were starting to.
So anything funny about that? People don't have water. Any ideas on what should have been done? Should that guy have been out there freewheeling with the press? I'm sure that the legal team was going, no, he's giving a timeline on what happened and we don't want that. So you don't really even need to have crisis communications training. This is, a lot of it's common sense. We can talk about all this stuff, but then when you see an example, you're like, no, that's wrong. So that's why we don't even have to have, you can get a whole degree in this, but then you look at that and you don't need to be trained further. The next one.
Take your questions. I'd like to share just a few brief opening comments. All of us at Boeing are deeply sorry for the loss of life in the Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 and Lion Air Flight 610 accidents. We feel the immense gravity of these events, and we recognize the devastation to the families and friends of the loved ones who have perished. There is nothing more important to us than the safety of the people who fly on our airplanes. Every day, 5.3 million people fly safely on Boeing airplanes. On average, more than 2,900 737 airplanes are in the air with nearly 500,000 passengers on board at any given time. And a 737 takes off around the world or lands roughly every 1.5 seconds.
That's so encouraging that they actually get some people to their destinations alive. Did anyone notice his eye contact? He had to look down to see that, we get people, So that guy had access to every trainer, like every professional service. To your point about the smaller companies, it's not just about the money or the resources. It's like somebody should have said something, right? And we know now, just in the last 24 hours, that somebody is taking a fall at Boeing. The trickle of information comes out about how safety was sacrificed for profit, and it really is not. I mean, this clip. I saw another clip of this CEO who said, "As we've said, we're sorry," and I thought, really? Oh, I'm so sorry that you have to say you're sorry again. That people died. It's kind of the opposite of the the empathy that really is convincing. Just in case you don't remember the facts, 189 died in Jakarta, Indonesia, right after takeoff, 157 in March after the other 737 MAX, Supermax, crashed right after takeoff. And I would say that the company is continuing to murder its brand with everything they're doing. It's had such a ripple effect to not only everyone's travel, but also to just the whole reputation of one of the biggest brands in the world. The next clip. How many people were here in 2015 when we had endless snow? This is like, it might give you PTSD, but But Beverly Scott, this is a pretty famous press conference that she had. And I just want to see, and some people thought that she was very candid and really sticking up for her team, and some people thought that her days were numbered after this.
Do you know what? I'm not even getting into those conversations. I wake up early in the morning, and let me tell you how I am. I've always been part of a team, and so I'm not a confused person at all. But I tell you the honest to God's truth. I love what I do. I have no. I don't. I've always laughed and told people, if you ever think that there's anybody else that you think can do it better, they should do it. Well, the governor said yesterday. I'm not getting into what I have had no direct conversation with the governor. I can only say that everybody is frustrated. I have had no conversation with the governor throughout the 3 weeks of what has been going on. And I'm not. Well, we have made absolutely no, anybody who would try to make a promise about what Mother Nature was going to wind up doing during this condition, and I don't think anybody would have ever thought, nobody could ever have thought that. That would have been completely foolish for anybody to be thinking that's, I'm just saying that absolutely not. How are you going to fix that? Well, let me tell you what we're doing. Exactly what I've told you, I have said throughout this, and I want to make a point particularly about the people that have been working for doggone near three weeks, many of them around the clock. I got a broad back. Anything that has happened is me. Because those folks that are out there and are continuing to be out there and will stay out there are giving it, they are absolutely poetry in motion, and they are tired, but they love this Commonwealth. 36 inches and all that, so this ain't this woman's first rodeo. And it is only because of the fact of the exceptional experience and knowledge of this team that they have been making a way out of no way, and they've been doing it for years without significant investment. Let me tell you, what we're going to do is to get things up as quickly as we can.
Any guesses for how long she had that job after that press conference? Anybody? 2 days? I think it was the next day, right? Yeah, it was the next day. And at first, it's interesting. If you look at the immediate reaction, people were like, wow, that was really candid. And then it was like, eh. And I don't know, but, she did resign, but I don't know if the governor had anything to do with that. It was a bad, bad time for the MBTA. And, everything's been working beautifully ever since. Won't talk about my commute this morning. Anyway, it was, the governor called the MBTA's performance unacceptable, and Scott resigned the next day, February 11th, 2015. That was after the interview went viral. It was 5 days after the interview went viral. But she did get a unanimous vote of gratitude and confidence from the MassDOT board, which was, it shows you the way that things were playing then. Then Obama nominated her to be on the National Transportation Safety Board, but she withdrew for personal reasons. Okay, one more.
And then obviously doing well this year, did well last year. That was reflected in your bonus. Do you have any regrets about the furore surrounding that?
I think, yeah.
Obviously, the construction of the bricks, follows on from how well Persimmon's doing. So I just thought the two issues were tied together, really. So
I'd rather not talk about that. It's been well covered, actually.
So you don't want to discuss that today? Are there any lessons to be learned from that? It was the biggest bonus in the country. No. Right, fine.
I think that's really unfortunate.
You don't even need to know who that guy is. We've had discussions about if you were the press person right there, would you take the bottle of water away from the guy that's going like this? Would you let the guy keep talking in this situation? Or does that make it worse? Any thoughts? If you grab the bottle away, that looks pretty obvious. And the press person who was saying it off the screen, no, that actually makes it worse. So the whole thing is that you have to deal with this in advance. And it's still a hard thing to cure once the CEO is out there. So it's really takes a little bit more prep and a little bit more thought. Any questions?
How do you find that balance when you're working with your in-house legal counsel and they always want to go back to, we let the client know in paragraph 3, subsection whatever, like it's been clearly communicated to people and you're trying to like, we need to have an empathetic approach and they just keep writing it back to, no, we've already told people, it's here. How do you work on that? Because, you know, they're still your in-house counsel, they're part of the team, you can't alienate them and you need them to be part of the process, but sometimes they approach it from a very letter of the law standpoint and you're trying to come at it with a human touch.
Maybe you need to find an example that shows how that didn't work out for someone else. You know, like someone else, another example of someone who, it was in the fine print, but it never really got communicated, like what the impact could be. Because I don't know what the exact situation is it's in there, but it is challenging to work with when you're all inside and you're in the same team, and yet there's that tug of war. And I would hope that you get to talk face to face, because I think that could be better than sometimes everybody emailing from their opposite sides of the office.
Video conference maybe, I mean, we have people all over the globe unfortunately, so the face-to-face doesn't always work out.
Yeah. It is better than just email, though. Zoom. But, you know, if you can show the impact of if people don't know and what could happen, that's what sometimes, you know, there's the letter of the law and then there's the real life impact. Or have someone outside tell them. Anybody else? So I'm so glad that we now know that if we just follow these instructions, BP's going to be okay, Boeing's going to be fine, the T's working beautifully if they just communicated better. So I've got a handout for you because I kind of went over the details of this stuff. If it's helpful, I can leave it at the door so I won't force it on you. And I'm happy to talk to anyone, you know, offline about any of this. Thanks very much.